Hello, and welcome to another FHIR for Developers tutorial video. My name is Gino Canessa. Today we're going to continue on our journey through profiles and validation. We're actually going to jump into some additional validation work today. I think we've gotten pretty much as far as we need to get on profiles. Same thing as our other goals. We want to build out some code patterns, eventually hopefully automate them. But in the meantime, establish what we can do to validate in our code, both profiles and things like that, but then also something that everyone can use to validate their business logic as they create these objects and use them, receive them, etc. So, with that said, there's a lot to do. Let's jump right in. I'm here in my project. I'm actually in the source folder of the GitHub repo, and just in case, we want to run our .NET restore, as always, to see what's going on. And perfect. Oops, we can just move this one out of the way a little bit. So I have gone and gotten rid of the warnings, just added the missing comments that were needed. Other than that, it's exactly where we left off in the last video. So let's run it once to see and make sure. Yep, we can see everything's still running. That's always a good sign. Since we're going to be diving into validation stuff, we want to kind of clean up what we're doing, though. I think, yeah, before we do this, let's actually, we'll clean up these functions a little bit. So let's make a new function here, private static, and this needs to return a patient. And that way we can move all this code out. We can clean this up. Perfect. And is this in too far? Yes, it is. There, that looks right. And then we want to return resource. And this I just want to move out some of this code to make our lives a little better. Oops. So we can get rid of these compiler directives, and we can actually shift these functions so they're in the right depth. That's weird. Edgar is confused about 2 or 4 space tabs for some reason. Interesting. Oh, that is interesting. I'm not sure why this got confused on that. Okay, whatever. So we have our create a patient, and we're going to do the same thing. Private static observation, I think. Create observation. And that way we can take all of this code when we're playing with observation and move this out as well. Perfect. Create a US core blood pressure observation. And we actually need to return our resource. But this gives us a lot cleaner options here for what we want to play with. And in this case, oops, we can scroll up to where we actually want it to be, up here. And then we should actually just move this out too. And we'll just do that. We'll do another function. And this will let us get to a better starting place. We'll call this validate official. And this is going to take in some sort of resource, and that way we can probably just grab this whole function, and we'll see if it yells at us for anything here. Yep, we need a few more things to pass in, and this is just standard refactoring. I probably could have done this off camera, but I try not to touch the project much off camera so that everything works the expected way. This is string profile directory. That'll give us that one. And string outcome JSON file name. Perfect. That'll work. Go through official FHIR validation. There we go. And that makes our lives a lot better. While we're here, we'll get rid of these things that are writing the entire resources onto the console. But now in our main program, we can just do something like resource equals create patients, since that's what we're going to do first. And then we can do validate official resource. And we need to pass it the rest of the things we said. Resource JSON file name, profile directory, and outcome JSON file. Perfect. And that's just a quick refactoring that we needed to do so that we're in a better place to work from. So we have all of our things, and we're not outputting anything because we got rid of that. But if we look at our outcome, that's fine because we're not interested in the actual. We can see that it is validating, and we can see that it actually has a problem right now, which is fine for what we're doing. Perfect. So with that said, we can finally get to where we wanted to. I'm actually going to use this package here. And so this is called FluentValidation. You can see it's got 86 million downloads. So we can be pretty confident that it's a robust package and it's still well maintained and everything else. And what this is going to let us do is create these validators on models and just establish rules. So you can see in this case they have their customer object and they're saying, you know, it has to have a surname that's not empty, it has to have a forename that's not empty, and then you can see they add a specific message. And you can build some really complex logic into these. And this is going to be useful because we'll start with the profiles we want to validate, but then in your own programs, you can use this and establish whatever rules you want to make sure you've done all the things that you wanted to do. You can see in the download now, they have the nice .NET CLI version, so we'll go ahead and just paste that. I'm actually going to get rid of the version tag because this is not production code, and I just want to always update to the latest whenever I do anything, because that's what we want to do here. If something does break, I can just fix it. You probably want to tag the version and update it specifically so you can test in your build and everything else. Okay, so let's start with patient, because that's what we always like to start with. Patient's a little simpler, but still lets us exercise everything. If we look at this, we can see some of the things we want to validate. We could start with some of these extensions just to make sure that we don't have multiple of them. And maybe we can add that, but the real interesting thing starts here with identifier. Now, it's kind of hard to see unless I zoom in, so let me zoom in. But you can see here that some of these are grayed out, like suffix is grayed out, whereas you can see family is, this part is not grayed out and this part is grayed out. If it's not super clear in the video, I guess over the whole screen you can see that some are grayed out and some aren't, you know, that's hard to do. But that's grayed out, that's not, that's grayed out. You know, the ones up here aren't. Oh, that's the range of my camera. So the things that are grayed out means that they haven't been changed. Now we've talked about that before, but we just want to make sure. So in particular, we want to pay attention to things that have changed in these first columns, because that really tells us things we want to validate in this particular module. Assuming that you would do building blocks and build something else to do just the core patient and things like that. So we can start with this identifier. We can see that identifier, we're saying there has to be at least one, and it has to have a value and a system. Perfect. Let's see what happens. So we're going to build a folder, validation. Oops. Oh, we have a validation folder here already. So we're going to create a new file. When I was doing my prep, I must have left that folder behind. US Core Patient Validator.cs. Perfect. We need all of our standard usings, so let's grab those. We also need a namespace, and that is validation, based on our folder name. So just like in the example there that I had up on the screen, we're going to create a class, US Core Patient Validator, and we're going to inherit from abstract validator, and we want that based on patient. So you can see this is a generic class that gives us all the tools we need to do the validation, but then we're going to restrict it to only show up on patient objects, because that's all we want to do. Here we want to make a class to validate patient objects against US Core, against the US Core patient profile. Perfect. And as always, we want to grab our URL so that we have it if we look things up later. I'll start with a note. One of the things that we've been doing in all of this is setting the meta. So we do like the resource.meta.profile. There's a lot of discussion back and forth on if you really should or not. In our case, the validator needs that in order to make sure that it gets validated against that profile. If not, it won't validate against that profile. But that said, same thing. If we go and look at US Core Patient, we can see that requirement never shows up here. So we don't want to validate that it actually has that field because that's not a requirement. Again, the FHIR validators, all the official things, need it because they don't have the additional type information and all these things that we're doing. There's no way to say just validate against it. Well, in some of the CLIs and things like that, we saw we can, but it was easier to just put it in. But we don't want to do that, and I just wanted to make that note that there's a lot of discussion back and forth. Some people think you should always tag it, some people think you should never tag it. But in this case, we don't want to validate it because it's not an actual requirement. So our first rule, as we said, is going to be, before we do that, we need to add using FluentValidation.validators. And we will have much better luck adding rules, I think. What am I missing? No, we don't even need that. Oh, because I'm not in a function. That helps. We need to make a constructor. There we go. Make a default instance of the US Core Patient Validator. Perfect. Now in here we can do rule 4. Perfect. So this rule 4, and again I can bring over the web page, and link will be in the GitHub repo. But you can see this takes in this lambda syntax here. So this first argument that it takes in is of type that we restricted to up here. And then we're picking the field, and then we're building rules on it. So in our case, we have a patient. I'm just going to use the letter P because we end up typing this quite a few times. For this example, we can type in patient. So patient, and our first one is going to be on patient.identifier. What rules do we want? Well, the first thing we can say, well, actually the first thing, which they don't touch on there, and you get to a little bit later, is this thing called a cascade mode. And this is essentially just saying whether you want to continue or stop. when you run into an error. In our case, well, generally speaking, the default is continue. And that's nice because if something fails validation, you might want to check and see all of the places that it failed validation. In our case, we're going to be looking inside these patient identifiers. And so if they were null, then we would throw an exception, and that's not what we want. So that lets us just do these not null and not empty checks and know that it'll stop whenever it hits one of these. So let's test that first. We have enough of a validator that we can check. We're going to create a patient, and before we do official validation, which actually we'll just comment out because it's so easy to do, we need to create a US core patient validator. And we need to add that using statement. And then what we do is create a validation result, I believe it is. And what we're going to do is ask our validator to validate against our resource. Now in this case, it's saying it can't convert because we restricted this to patient, remember? Now in our case, we know it's a patient, so we can take our pick of how we want to do it. But in this case, we'll just do a patient. So you can see it was already giving us that much. And then validation result is yelling at us because we need to pick that. This validation result, what it's just going to tell us is something like validation passed first. And that's in this is valid. And then if it fails, so if the validation result is not valid, we can actually traverse each validation failure in validation result dot errors, and that's an unfortunate historical naming difference. And we can just put this out. Now in this case, we know that we were doing our US core patient, but we can say validation error, validation issue, and then we can put failure.property name. So that's telling us the exact property that failed, and that's the thing here. So in this case, it's going to tell us that identifier failed. And then it's going to give us a message. So right now this is going to pass. Hopefully it'll pass. And we can see, let's get rid of this found US core birth sex so that we have even less. Let's just comment this out. We know that that works and we don't have to worry about it. Perfect. So we can see validation passed was true. Now the only thing we're checking is that we have identifiers. So we'll add more in a moment, but let's just make sure that it will fail if it's supposed to fail. And yes, false. So you can see this identifier must not be empty. And so that's pretty straightforward. It's just saying, yeah, what failed here is that the identifier was empty. Now what's interesting is you probably would have expected it to be null, but here we actually created all this. So if we get rid of this and comment that whole piece out, we should get a different error message. The internal library will create one for us anyway. So I like leaving the null check there, but we don't actually need it in that case. So if we remember, there was another piece to this requirement, and that piece of the requirement was saying that it needs to have a system and a value. So if we go right here, and let's duplicate this and close that, and let's say we got rid of the system. This is valid FHIR, but it's not going to be valid against US core patient. We've done that kind of thing before, but we don't want it to be here. We don't have a check for it yet, so let's add one. Now in this case, we're going to, you can see now in this set of rules, we're going to use the same type of syntax, but what we're getting is the list of identifiers, because that's what we have here. And the rule just says that we need to have at least one that has a system and a value. So in our case, we can just say list has any, and we're just doing the standard Lambda syntax here, and we'll give it ID, and we want to say not string.is null or empty on ID system, and not string.is null or empty on ID.value. And I think we ended up with an extra one, or no? Nope, okay. So now when we run this, we should see identifier, the specified condition was not met for identifier. Okay, so it failed, but it wasn't a terribly useful description of what happened. But we can fix that. We can just add this with message, and we can say patient dot, and actually it already has that part because we already have the field name. So we can say something like, we can add patient dot identifier requires one element with both a system and a value. So now when we run it, we get issue was found on identifier. Patient identifier requires one element with both a system and a value. So if we do this, and now we have both, we should still pass validation. Yes, because we have one that has both a system and a value, even though we have one that's just a value. Perfect. So that gives us everything we need to validate against. I'm just changing the brightness here a little bit so that as the sun moves. I apologize, I've moved my setup and did not bring the light with me. So I apologize for that, but I wanted to make sure to get this out today. So the next thing we want to check is actually on human name. So this is similar, but a little bit more complicated, and that's why I want to make sure to get to this one. It's saying here that we have to have a given and or a family or a data absent reason. So that rule is going to be a little bit harder to express in here. And that's just because we don't have any way of putting ors in this. This, I'm pretty washed out. I can't really fix that. So apologies again for the little thumbnail of me quality, but we'll have that fixed for the next video. So if we look at this, when we say we want a rule for, and same thing, patient, and so I was saying we want, just for consistency, we want them all the same. In this case, we know there's a patient, so we can use that. And we're going to build on patient.name. These ors are going to, like I said, be really complicated to do. So the simplest thing to do, I found, is just create a function for them. So we're going to create a public bool. Now this invariant that's requiring this is called US Core 8. So in our quest to make things as matchy as possible, we'll just do test US Core 8. And this is actually going to take in a human name, because that's, human name is this list, what the name is there. That's the backbone element type, it's named human name. It's a complex data type there. Sorry, not a backbone element, it's a complex data type. So in here, we can now do something a lot simpler, because what we can do is say if not string dot is null or empty name dot family, let's start with that one, then we can return true. If not string dot is null or empty name dot given, and now here given is actually an array. So what we actually want, if name dot given does not equal null, and name dot given has any element such that the given is not null or empty, then we want to return true. So this was a little more complicated, the same type of thing we did in this must up here. We just want to say, make sure that the given array isn't, the list in this case, isn't null. And then if it isn't null, check to see if we have any given name in there that's not null. So the first part is checking for the array, and this is checking for an element in that array that's not null. The last one is that we can have this data absent reason. And so here, same thing, we're just going to look at name.has extensions first. Actually, we don't even need to do that. We can just get the extension. And at this point, it's not going to be a problem. So we're going to say get extensions, and this we want US for patients. Oops. We don't have a data absent URL yet. So this says that we can use that extension, but it doesn't, we haven't actually defined it anywhere else because we didn't use it yet. So here you can see, and again, I'll put the link, but we can see that there's a URL for the extension of data absent reason. And this is just, it's pretty interesting. It's just a list of reasons why you don't have a value. So for instance, you can say it's asked but unknown, not asked, asked but declined. So if a patient came in to the ER and they were unable to be asked, well, then it's not asked or temporary unknown, things like that. Whereas if they came in and said, no, I'm not going to tell you my name, asked but declined. So it kind of specifies out why we don't have a value. We'll get in the habit of doing these public, just so that we have access to them in other places if we need. We shouldn't in this case, but we could probably find a better home for this. And here, I don't remember our syntax. I think it was URL extension data absent reason. And we can just put that there. And be annoyed that the editor is doing that still for some reason. Canonical URL for the data absent reason extension. And even though it is right below, we want to put it here so that we can see, because they're actually a little different. So in this case, we want to get any extensions that have URL data absent reason, because you might have multiple of them, and we can just check for any. So what this is going to do is say, if we have a family name, we're fine. If we have any given name that's not null or empty, we're fine. Or if we have a data absent reason, we're fine. And otherwise, we are not fine. Test a human name against the variant US for 8. Perfect. So now we have a couple of choices here. And there's actually an active discussion on this right now. And so I'm going to kind of show both, and we can talk about what happens later when that gets resolved. But there's a question to say, is this supposed to apply to every name, or is this supposed to apply to just one of the names? And really, both models are valid for different things. I'm not sure how this will pan out in US Core, but I'll show how to do both because there's times when you would want both in your own logic and validation. So the easier one, and actually we should be labeling these, test patient.identifier minimum 1 with a system and value. And here we're going to say patient.name. These are supposed to be lowercase because we're using the FHIR versions. And we're going to say minimum 1 with a family given or DAR, data absent reason. So we'll do this one first. And we're just going to say, assume that it only has to apply to one. So in this case, we're going to, again, take in our list, and we're going to look for anything on the list that validates the name against US Core 8 and returns true. So that's pretty straightforward. We'll want to put a message just so that it's a little more clear. And we'll say patient name requires one name with a family given or data absent reason. So in this case, we're going to say just check for one name that has this matching. We should be able to just run. And validation passed. Perfect. If we get rid of the human name element from our patient code, now when we run, it should fail, and it gives us our nice message. Patient name requires one name with a family given or data absent. So we got rid of the name entirely. Here we can do the same thing if we say there is a name, but we don't give it one of those things. It should also fail with the same error. Perfect. Then just to test, we can also say if we do this, so now we're giving it both a name that passes and a name that fails, and in our case, it should still pass. Perfect. So that takes care of something where we're checking to see if one of them meets it. The other way is actually easier. And there's a few ways of doing this, but in this case, there's actually a few ways you could do it. So one of them is, for instance, if we just wanted to do the lowest and say minimum 1, all with family given or DAR. And then we say we can do the same thing in the other way. We could say we don't want any that do not pass US Core 8. Requires all names have a family given or data absent reason. So what we did here is we just said, okay, instead of just saying any one has it that passes, now we said, no, any one that doesn't have it fails. So here, if we get rid of our spare human name that was empty, now it'll pass. Perfect. You can also write this out by searching into the elements. So you could do something like rule for each, and then same thing, we're going to do patient, patient.name, and then this actually now applies a specific rule to each name in this patient. So this you can just do with the name, And you can see the typing here. Since here we have the list of human names, what we did for each. Here we just have the human name, and then we could do that here. So either of those styles work. Since we have the one or the all, I kind of like that these are very similar to each other. Of course, you could also write these tests the inverted way so that these return false, instead of test passes US core 8, which might be nice to say this. You can write test fails US core 8 if you were planning on doing all that way. It would just clean up your code a little bit. Perfect. So that's given us a lot already. Next, we have something similar with telecom that's saying it doesn't have to be present, but if it is, those are pretty similar. Gender just has to be not null. We don't have one of that model, so I'll show one of that, but you can, by now it's pretty straightforward that we just do patient.gender, and in this case we say not null. Because gender is a nullable, and you can see that in this case our model already has an enum, but it's a nullable enum, and so we can just say patient gender is not null, and we can just say patient gender is required. And same thing, we would want to put a comment here. To do that. Perfect. So there is obviously a lot left to do. I was hoping to get into observations and slicing, but just looking at the time on the video, I think that'll have to be the next segment, and I should have that out soon as well. So again, if this is helpful, please do leave a like, comment. Those things help. And anything else, please let me know if you have any questions or comments. I do my best to reply, and you can contact me on Zulip or as well. Thanks for watching, and cheers.